joined in so far. I'm Daniel Leonard. I'll be your host today on Gardening in the Panhandle Live. We have an excellent group of panelists here today to talk about pollinators and all of the wonderful things they do for us in the garden and landscape. So I'll do a quick introduction of these folks. We're pleased to have with us today Dr. Gary Knox, a horticulture professor and extension specialist from North Florida Research and Education Center. How are you doing today, Dr. Knox?
Doing great. Glad to be here.
Awesome. We've got Mary Salinas, a residential horticulture agent and master gardener coordinator over in Santa Rosa County. She also sort of spearheads the Panhandle Butterfly House, so she brings some unique pollinator expertise to us. How are you, Mary?
I'm doing great today. Thank you.
Good to have you with us today. We've got Mark Tansig, who is the horticulture agent and master gardener coordinator in the big city of Tallahassee over in Leon County. What's happening, Mark?
Doing all right.
Good.
Can't wait to talk pollinators.
Yeah. And finally, I have a special guest today with Dr. Knox, Heather Kalaman, a graduate student working on her master's and PhD with Dr. Knox. Hey, Heather. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And you're all the way down in Orlando today, correct?
Today I am in Orlando.
Yeah. So we've got folks from all over the place. So we thank everybody for being here as far as our panelists go, and also want to give a shout out to Julie McConnell, our behind the scenes producer, and Beth Bowles for handling the Zoom webinar chat. Beth will be posting links to some of the various things that we talk about today in the chat, so feel free to take a look there and shoot her an email and tell her how good of a job she does. We appreciate her being here. So with that, let's get started on gardening with pollinators. We're just going to dive right into the questions. We'll be here about an hour. So for the next hour, we're going to talk pollinators and nerd out a little bit. We're going to take advantage of our special guest today and start with Dr. Knox. We've got a bunch of questions on this topic, Dr. Knox. So this is like, I'm a beginner, how to get started gardening with pollinators, and just kind of go over some of the best plants to plant. So this kind of like the crash course into pollinator gardening here. I'll let you take that away here for a few minutes.
All right, sure. So some of the basic plants that are always great for attracting pollinators. I guess let's start small and go up from there. Actually, okay. A lot of our herbs are really awesome plants. Oregano, rosemary, basil, thyme, catnip, mint. They're wonderful plants for attracting pollinators. And so they're also give us, of course, food benefits as well. Sure. A lot of annuals and perennials. A lot of our Florida wildflowers are great. Coreopsis, purple coneflower, gaillardia or blanket flower. Awesome plants. Salvias, both the native and the non-native ornamental salvias are also great for pollinators. I'm sure I'm overlooking a lot here too, but I'm just trying to gloss it over and quickly move up the list here. Moving into some shrubs, I think probably some of the ones that we don't think of very often as ornamentals, but Simpson stopper and buttonbush are two native shrubs that are awesome for attracting pollinators. And then moving up to trees, our native redbud is a great plant for early in the spring. And then hollies are just overall awesome for attracting pollinators too.
So going back to some of those lesser known shrubs, are we talking about the blooms, or are they also host plants?
They're primarily bloom, the flowers, and it's very interesting. They're like the buttonbush is like a ball of stamens.
Yeah, I've seen that. That's an interesting little plant.
Yeah, so that's some of the attraction there.
Okay, so he's given us 7 or 8, 10 really good plants to get started. As far as Heather, do you have anything to add on that? Just some plants that Dr. Knox might have missed that you know are just sort of surefire pollinator attractors?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with a lot of the herbaceous plants he listed. Monarda is also a great one, spotted bee balm, calamintha as well. Okay. I think that performs well in North Florida. I know we can grow it in Gainesville. The native plants are admittedly my favorite. Coccinia. I'm really big into asters as well. Gaillardia picella, a ton of different Coreopsis species. As far as trees and shrubs, I think beautyberry is really great. A lot of the prunus species as well. I know when they flower in our garden at the office, they're just absolutely covered in bees.
Very good.
One of my favorite plants is sea grape as well. And
Yeah, if we get much more climate change, we're going to be growing sea grape up here in the Panhandle. We've already got some mangroves here and there, so you may want to keep that in mind. But
yeah, a positive to a negative for sure.
yeah. So, Dr. Knox, kind of with that, this is a related question. We've got a bunch. Tallahassee is a popular location. So specifically, I know you live near the Tallahassee area. If you could pick a few plants to grow in some of those red hill soil types that they have over there, what would you point people towards?
Okay. Well, again, I'm a big fan of the salvias, big fan of rosemaries, things like
Okay.
that, which will do great as perennials, or you could do some as annuals as well.
Yeah.
The red buckeye, again, one of our traditional early season plants, and our native red buds. And really, it needs to be a red bud that has its history, its origins in the lower South. If you try to plant a red bud from further north, it doesn't have as much benefit to us as one of our own native ecotypes.
Right. A lot of those red bud selections were bred up in the McMinnville area and all that, and they just perform as well here for us.
They don't perform as well. They will flower, but they flower a lot later in the season, and it's really the early flowering of red bud of our native ecotype that is the great advantage for when these pollinators emerge from winter and are eager to find some food sources.
Yeah, I know we've got a question coming up later about fall pollinators, but I've never really thought about those early season like red bud and red buckeye, plants that I enjoy in the garden. So what do they attract that early? What's going on in the pollinator world then?
Well, actually, and I'll actually back it up a little bit more. We really need to be thinking about winter flowering plants too, because with climate change or mild winters that we've been experiencing, honeybees, bumblebees, and even a lot of the other native bees are out foraging during the winter when it warms up every day and we have sunny days. And there aren't a whole lot of native things that flower then, other than things like red maple and the red buckeye and the red bud and so on. But then we can look at things like mahonias, winter honeysuckle, winter jasmine, and maybe even some of the camellias that have a simple flower.
With the big yellow stamen in the middle.
Yellow stamens in the middle, those are also things that during the middle of winter that these pollinators can go to.
That's a great point. I've never really planned my garden based on winter pollinators, but might need to think about that going forward. Sort of that.
If I can add one tree to that, the loquat. So we had a big loquat here in our orchard, and the pollinators are all over it in the wintertime because it blooms, when it's cold out.
Awesome. That's some really good selections for winter time. Mark, since you just chimed in, we're going to come straight over to you. So what are some good, in your opinion, we just talked about winter and early spring. So what are some really good late summer and fall pollinators? So like right now through, October. So what's going to be blooming coming up that some of these folks can add into their garden to attract pollinators?
Yeah, what I did is I walked through our gardens and kind of take a look and see what the pollinators were all over. And Rachel Mathis, our program assistant, helped out. But things like solidago, so goldenrods, are really great in the late part of the summer, going into the fall. Some of them are available commercially. You have things like winged sumac, which may just come up on its own.
That's getting ready to bloom right now. I've seen that in the woods around and about.
Yep. Don't forget, I know Dr. Knox or Heather didn't mention Biden's alba, but Spanish needles.
Oh, no.
Typically a terrible weed in our garden, but pollinators absolutely love it. And as you know, it just keeps on flowering and seeding, basically until it dies in the winter. So that's a really good one. The pollinators are all over that one all the time. But there's also like chase tree is one that pollinators love at our place. Firebush or Hamelia patens. Pentas do really well until we get a freeze. And sometimes we have some here in the garden that are overwintering. So pentas are really great for pollinators. One I really like that I recently planted at my house, and I've noticed pollinators are all over it, and it just blooms all year long, is the beach dune sunflower. So that's a really good one. And then let's see, basils. Dr. Knox spoke about some of our herbs, and also the monarda or bee balms. So if you go to we just went to the beach last weekend, and the bee balm is flowering all along the roadside. So that's a really great one for pollinators.
Yeah, so we've got 4 seasons of pollinator plants there in the chat for you to pick from, some of our panelists' favorites. I'm going to throw this one to Dr. Knox. This was a late question we got. I don't know if you had a chance to take a look at it, but we've covered quite a bit. It has like a 4-part question, and I don't do 4-part questions, so I'm going to select the part that I want to ask. So I thought this was interesting. The first part was, what would your ideal pollinator garden consist of? But that's not really what I want to talk about. The part that I'm interested in is, would your ideal pollinator garden be in Florida? And if not, where would you want to construct a pollinator garden?
Oh yeah, I think Florida, really warm climates are the way to go. Warm climates and sunshine are really.
We have that 4-season pollinator attraction here that they don't get in some places.
That's right. That's right. So I really think that we have a big advantage because we can have winter flowering things here, as we talked about already, and then we have great soils and climates for plants. 3 seasons of the year we're going gangbusters. So yeah. Great place to have it in Florida.
Heather's a little farther south, so she might even be better than us for doing that year round.
I agree. Zone 9 might be better. So those of you along the coast might actually be a little bit better than us closer to the Georgia border.
So yeah, it seems like, fortunately for all of us and our attendees, you are in like pollinator primetime spot here in Florida. So that's awesome. That's good. We're first in something other than COVID cases, so that's good. Let's go to Mary. Mary, we hadn't touched base with you too much yet. Mary, this is a Zoom question, and this is an interesting one. This is a genus of plants that we haven't talked about yet. Are there any native palm trees? Florida's kind of known as a palm tree state. Any native palm trees that benefit pollinators?
Absolutely. So many times we think of pollinator plants and think of, our perennials or our wildflowers and such, but our native trees, and I think Gary touched on this, our trees are also really attractive to pollinators. And yes, we do have some native palms that are wonderful pollinator plants. Our cabbage palm, which is our state tree. And then there's a variety of different palmettos, the saw palmetto, scrub palmetto, that are also really good nectar plants. As a matter of fact, at a lot of farm markets and places where you're going to find local honey, you'll see palmetto honey.
That's right.
So yes.
Yeah, it seems like around here next to Tupelo and our favorite, the Chinese tallow tree, palmetto is some of the favorite honey. So that's interesting. That's good. So yeah, the answer to the question, are there native palm trees that benefit pollinators, seems yes, particularly the native palms. So good. Mark, this is a question that we get all the time. This is in both the ag and the horticulture world. It gets a lot of interest. So the question is how to get pollinators and get rid of harmful bugs. And essentially, I think what they're asking is, can you do both?
Well,
yeah.
It's hard to say that if you plant certain plants, you're going to get only the good bugs and none of the bad bugs are going to come along. But, we've talked a lot about already the diversity of plants you can put in your garden to attract pollinators. The good thing about that is when you have a lot of diversity, you're going to have more diversity of insects. And so a lot of times you're going to bring in the predators of those harmful bugs. So, at IFAS and at most of the land-grant colleges, we're really big into integrated pest management. So the idea of making sure what you see really is harmful. So, just because you see a worm, a lot of people call the caterpillars just worms, right? So
yeah.
Just because you see one of these caterpillars in your garden, don't assume that it's doing something harmful, but observe it and watch it. And, at some point, if that level of damage becomes, bad enough where we need to do some treatment, I think later we're going to talk about, folks are asking, how do I get, a similar type of question. It has to do with the pesticides you're using. So don't go crazy with the pesticides because you're going to harm the good ones. You're going to harm the predators. So it's all about, bringing in diversity and being able to handle a little bit of damage from those bad ones. And when you see something wrong, make sure you identify exactly what it is and find out how to, go after that one selectively rather than all the other ones.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, one of my favorite parts about the modern chemical and pesticide world is it's gotten really selective. You know, there's some pesticides out there that target some really specific things, so it's not a kill-all type situation all the time.
There's even some, bio type products that you can use that, do a lot better at protecting the good ones and going after those bad ones you don't want.
That's right. So that's good. You don't have to run the mosquito truck through your garden to control these insects. That's really good. So there's a bunch of similar questions to that, but I'm gonna kind of summarize them real quick, Mark, here. How do I get more pollinators in my vegetable garden? So we want to get rid of all those bad bugs, but we also want to attract pollinators. So how do we get the pollinators in there?
I think the question's coming up. I think it's my question again about moths. And the interesting thing is a lot of those caterpillars that are causing destruction in your vegetable garden, the adult version of that moth or that cat, a lot of those caterpillars become moths and they are actually pollinating some of your vegetable plants. So again, diversity, bringing as many, in your vegetable garden, you're going to have your food crops, but around that, you can have a lot of diversity of good pollinator plants. You're watching the way you do pesticide applications and only doing it when it's needed. You're going to be bringing in more pollinators without harming, some of the, without harming those, the good ones, the beneficial. So, be careful with the products you're using so that you don't wipe them all out. Yeah.
I know one thing that I've done this year that has really seemed to encourage pollinators is the parts of my garden that I don't have any plants in, or, maybe a little bare spot, is just to plant a little cover crop of like buckwheat or something like that. And that's really,
I was just going to say that, Daniel, they did that here where they used, in our vegetable garden, they used buckwheat as a cover crop, and it brought in a whole bunch of really good pollinators and a lot of predators for those things that might go after aphids or some of your other, pest insects.
Really, what did it bring in?
A lot of wasp species that are predators on a lot of our, vegetable pests.
Okay, very good. Heather, this is a question from one of our Zoom listeners, just kind of a general question. What can we do to help pollinators on an individual landscape level?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I kind of have like a few steps I always find myself repeating over and over.
That's all right.
So growing pollinator-friendly resources, obviously, variety is important to attract a variety of different pollinator types, and whether that's floral shapes or floral colors. So growing those pollinator-friendly resources. Also providing nesting area is really important as well. So trying to find areas of your yard that maybe you can leave patches of bare ground or brush piles. Native grasses are really awesome for that as well. Muley grass, love grass. So leaving those piles of plants around or bare ground so that native bees in particular do nest in the ground. About 70% of them do. Avoiding or minimally using pesticides, as you discussed, as much as possible, and then really talking about it, spreading the word. I think pollinator health and pollinator-friendly resources are a really hot topic right now. We're having this event, so continuing to read and learn and discuss as much as possible.
There you go. Kalaman's 5-step program to encourage pollinators. I like it. So, Dr. Knox, building off of that a little bit and building off of some of what we've already talked about, I know we've mentioned these before, but you didn't specifically mention where they grew. And so here we've gotten a bunch of questions, folks that have shady landscapes. What shade plants attract pollinators?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's really the sunny locations will tend to attract more pollinators. And the other situation, of course, is generally with most plants, the more sun you have, the more flowers you have.
Right.
Yes, there are some plants adapted to shade that we can look at for pollinators to visit. From a native standpoint, we've already talked about beautyberry and really red buckeye, which can tolerate some shade as well. Oak leaf hydrangea to a certain extent. If we talk about, we can talk about a sweet pepper bush, clethra.
Okay, yep.
Sweet shrub, itea, We can talk about buttonbush and Simpson stopper that we already mentioned. All of those can tolerate some shade. They will do better in more sun, but they can tolerate some shade. Looking to the non-natives, actually, big leaf hydrangea, if we choose the lace cap types, the lace cap types have more of the true flowers that don't have the sepals, and so the pollinators can find them.
The quote unquote less attractive versions of the hydrangeas.
Hey, wait a minute, I like the lace cap. I like them better. But anyway, again, the camellias with the simple flowers can do that. Mahonias, impatiens, and taurinia are two of our ornamental flowers, bedding plants.
Taurinia is the wishbone flower.
Wishbone flower, right? And then abelia. Abelia is an awesome pollinator.
Okay. The little shrubs.
They're shrubs. And again, a lot of these can tolerate shade, and they will actually do a little bit better in sun, but still, they give you some ideas for some shade plants.
Yeah, so if you have a shady landscape, all is not lost. So, Dr. Knox, we're going to stick with you for a question that came through the Q&A. You've not had time to prep for this, but since we've just been through this in the last 2 years, I figured you could handle it. What happens to pollinators during a hurricane, such as Hurricane Michael, like we had a couple years ago? Do they go on away too?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer for sure, and I actually may call on Heather to speculate here. But I would think that a lot of the pollinators would, go to ground, go to their nest, whatever it may be, under leaves, on tree trunks, perhaps if they're burrows, something like that. Heather, can you speak to some of the native bee behavior as to how they might react?
Not specifically, but I think the general idea is kind of keep calm and carry on. I think because a lot of the native bees do nest in the ground, as opposed to in, hollowed out plant material. There's probably a lot of variation in that. That will probably significantly differ too from the way managed honeybees are taken care of during big storms as well, in bee boxes and things like that.
So they probably don't all get blown away.
Hopefully not, yeah.
Mary, it looks like you had something to say there. What do you think about pollinators? What happens to butterflies in a hurricane? I assume that they get displaced a little bit, but
that's a good question, and I don't have a good answer for you.
Well, it obviously doesn't provide a long-lasting impact because we had a Category 5 storm roll through my county here, and it's been a great pollinator year. Pollinators everywhere, so maybe for a year or so some of them get displaced, but many of them, sounds like from Heather and Dr. Knox, are able to just continue on. Very good. I mean, they live here, so they should be adapted to some extent to storms. So, All right, Mary. Since you failed me on that one, I'm going to pick on you again. So, this is like a two-part milkweed question here. Milkweed's very popular, particularly in the butterfly world. Are all milkweeds pollinators? Perennials. Are all milkweeds perennials?
Well, yes, to start off with, first off, milkweed is really popular in the pollinator world and in the butterfly gardening world because, of course, it's the host plant for the monarch butterfly, and monarchs create a lot of interest in people these days. We're all rooting for the monarch and their really unique migration that they have. The native milkweeds that we have, yes, they are perennial. Sometimes they can be kind of weakly perennial though. They may not last forever. So sometimes they do die out after a few years. We have found that. But they seem to, keep pushing up new plants and keep propagating. Now here in the Panhandle, sometimes the tropical milkweed, which is not native, but it is probably the most popular milkweed that is sold and grown here.
It's the easiest one to find.
Yes, it's not always perennial. It can get killed back by by frosts and freezes, and sometimes not come back. But yes, it's generally perennial.
All right. And sort of the second part of this question, and I've had this problem before on some Asclepias perennis, I think, the aquatic milkweed. This is a Zoom question. Should you treat milkweeds for all those aphids that get on it, or just leave them alone? If you treat, is it a problem?
You know, that we get a lot of questions about what to do about all those aphids, and those little yellow-orange aphids are called Oleander aphids, and I think they're going to put up a link to a publication on that. They seem to follow aphids everywhere. I even have a volunteer who was talking about a milkweed that she had inside her enclosure, her porch, that was covered with aphids. You know, they get in no matter what. Yep. The problem with treating them with any kind of a pesticide is that if you have some monarch caterpillars on there, you're going to be killing them as well. There are predators for those aphids, and maybe, you know, you should kind of let them do their work. There is a parasitoid that lays its egg inside the aphids, and they get inside and they eat their way, you know, through. And if you notice some aphids that turn kind of tan color and then brown, and they're rounder, those are aphids that have been parasitized. And even though they're still sitting on the leaves, they're not feeding, they're not doing any damage. Then what's really cool is when that parasitoid is fully formed, it'll chew a little hole in the top of the aphid and then fly away and mate and lay eggs on other aphids. So it's pretty cool how that happens. If you just watch what's going on with your plants when they're covered with aphids, a lot of times you can see this process, and you'll see some other predators that are coming along and feeding on those aphids. At my house, I have a lot of assassin bugs that are always.
Yeah, I've seen those around and about.
Yes.
Yeah, so I just watched Alien the other night, and this is just bringing to mind the face hugger and chest burster. It's terrible.
There's Danielle Sprague, our ag agent over in Jefferson's, got a great video on YouTube of these larvae eating the aphid. Pretty cool.
Yeah, it's fantastic for sure. Thanks, Mary. So those are two commonly asked milkweed questions that Mary just knocked out of the park for us. I appreciate it. So we're going to go to Heather down in Orlando. Heather, what's the name of the bee that burrows? And second part, I said I don't do two-part questions, but I'm going to allow this. Can they get out if their burrow is accidentally covered up?
Yeah, so I did see that question. It was an awesome question. A lot of native or wild bees do burrow or excavate their nests in the ground. So I know I mentioned earlier, like almost 70% of native or wild bees actually nest in the ground. So I think that there should be, there's some links posted for some awesome resources on identifying different native bees and kind of familiarizing yourself with which ones do nest in the ground if you're trying to attract those types of pollinators. The bee boxes are super cool and very cute, and those can serve as nesting sites for around 30% of wild bees.
So we're not dealing with just one species of bee. There's lots of solitary bees in the ground.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
There is a type of native bee called a mining bee, which will specifically build its nest out of dirt and mud and things like that. But a lot of native bees nest in the ground. Most of them do.
Very good. So did you touch on, I'm not sure if you touched on the uncovering them. If they get covered up, what happens?
Right.
Construction or a tilling situation or something like that, what would happen? Could they get out?
Yeah.
Is that it for that bee?
So I imagine if you know, just thinking off the top of my head, I don't have a ton of experience with this, but I'm thinking if it's like loose dirt or loose plant material, yeah, I'm sure some bees could find their way out. If it's densely packed and they're not able to find their way out, I'm sure that they would suffer because of that for sure.
Yeah, so to minimize bee damage, you should maybe not do any major construction where you might have solitary bees.
Sure.
Okay, very good. Mary, we're coming back to you for a Zoom question. So these folks have herbs. How do you stop the swallowtails from laying eggs on parsley? And do they like to lay eggs on flat leaf parsley?
Well, I think the only way you can prevent them from laying eggs on your parsley is to bring your parsley inside.
Yeah.
Or, you know, grow it on a screen patio.
Okay.
Inside. Because, you know, I don't know how else you would deter them. But what I would suggest is that you just plant some parsley for yourself and some for the black swallowtails. They also will lay their eggs on dill and fennel. So you can plant some of those in your garden, and maybe they will go to those plants instead. And they're highly ornamental, you know, especially the bronze fennel. It's beautiful, and you can integrate that into your landscape design and maybe get them to go over there.
Plant enough for everybody.
Yes, and you know, if they do land on they do lay eggs and you have little caterpillars on your parsley and you want to save that, if you have some other plants, you can move them over there.
All right, that's a good way to do it. So once again, Mary coming through in the clutch here. So this is going to be for Heather and Dr. Knox. This is a newer question we got kind of last minute on Zoom. I know that you've touched on this a little bit, but are some plants more adapted to specific pollinators?
I think the answer is yes. I
Sure.
think there are, for example, isn't it blueberries that have very specific types of bees that pollinate blueberries? So there
Right.
are very specific host relationships there. Heather, do you want to touch on that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that flowers have certain traits that have co-evolved with certain types of pollinators, obviously, over time. So whether you're talking about pollinators that prefer different colors, like blues, yellows, and whites for bees, or colors on the warmer spectrum for a lot of lepidopteran or butterfly and moth pollinators. I think plants also, you know, exhibit a wide range of chemical cues that are really attractive to certain pollinators as well, and their bloom periods, and how that kind of corresponds to emergence patterns with different insects as well. So yeah, I think a lot of plants have kind of adapted to be more attractive to pollinators, and kind of how that plays into their reproduction as well.
Awesome. And then you've got some plants like we were talking about before we started, like lantana, that just like attracts everything. So some are more than others. Yeah. So awesome. This is a kind of a question for the whole group. We talked a little bit about this beforehand. I'm gonna start with Mark though. Mark, what is your most rare or unusual pollinator find?
Well, I like this question, and I'm going to pick the insect that we probably all hate the most, and that is the mosquito. So a lot of folks don't often realize that mosquitoes can be pollinators. And I did find a pretty good link talking about, you know, how this happens. And apparently it's mostly the males. You know, the males do a lot of flying. They're not going around for blood meals. They're going around flower to flower collecting nectar. And they happen to pollinate while they're doing that. So, you know, everything has its role, right?
Yeah. So the next time we hear somebody say, I don't know why mosquitoes are on this earth, they don't serve any purpose, you can say, yes, they do.
There you go.
So Dr. Knox, I know you're real interested in magnolias. Maybe you could give us an unusual or rare pollinator find that goes to the Magnolias genus.
Yeah, exactly. Well, in general, beetles or certain beetles tend to be major pollinators for magnolias. And
Really?
they have a very complex floral phenology in magnolias. A lot of the species types have the female parts that are receptive before the male parts that release the pollen. So you need beetles to travel from an open flower to an unopened flower in order to pollinate a magnolia. So it's really complicated.
Really? So, seems like Magnolia made that a little harder than it had to be.
Yeah.
That is what it is. Heather, I know that you've got an answer to this question too. What's one of your favorite pollinator finds?
Yeah, so when I think of rare pollinators, I guess I think of like the insects that are pollinating some of our favorite food crops that maybe we don't ever give them credit for. So flies are really important pollinators, particularly midges, which is a
Flies
species
as in adult maggots?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Think about that next time you eat something.
I try to always think about that time I eat. But midges are a species of fly that actually pollinate the cacao or chocolate trees. Also reptiles. I've seen a ton of literature over the last few years talking about different reptiles like skinks in Brazil and Tasmania that you know, a lot of the pollen from the stigmas will stick to their scales, and you know, reptiles acting as pollinators is always very curious to me too.
There you go. Now, so next time you eat chocolate, flies are responsible. Mary, you got an answer for this question? What's your favorite pollinator, or most interesting or rare?
Yes. Well, you know, one that really kind of interests me is bats. I know people generally, you know, are kind of repulsed by bats. You know, we've all watched Dracula movies way too much. But they pollinate agave plants. You know, in the Southwest and Central America, and, you know, agave gives us tequila. So, you know.
Think of bat.
Bats, I think, you know, they're nighttime pollinators. So those flowers on those plants that they pollinate, you know, are going to be opening up at night. And that's important in a desert environment.
Yeah, I just learned so much about pollinators in that question. That's my favorite question so far. Thank you guys. Mary, we're going to stay with you. So are there any, Mark kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but we didn't get into any specifics. Are there any safe alternatives to keeping pollinator larvae from eating cantaloupe leaves and not harming all the other pollinators? So I assume we're talking about caterpillar pests here.
Yes. So unfortunately, you know, sometimes we do have caterpillars that are decimating our vegetable crops, and
Sure.
and we can't really allow that. You know, we have to, you know, have our cucumbers, so, or cantaloupes. So what you can
Both
do,
cucurbits, it's okay.
yes, any of those.
Yeah.
So what you can do is use a product that is going to only target those caterpillars on those plants. And BT, which is a naturally occurring bacteria that only infects caterpillars, can be, you know, just put on the plants that you want to protect. I think we're going to put a link up there to an EDIS publication on natural products for pest control in the home landscape. And in that, there is a discussion on BT. You can get it as a liquid or a powder, but you really want to be careful when you apply it, especially as a powder, that it's not going to drift onto, let's say, your milkweed or your dill or other plants where you want those caterpillars to be feeding, because it will kill nearly all different species of caterpillars.
Right. So
Also,
the answer seems to be yes, you can kill caterpillars.
yes, you can. You can.
Seems like you had an epilogue to that. What was that also coming there?
Well, I also wanted to share the U-Scout page from the North Florida Research and Education Center on cucurbits that has a really good page on all kinds of problems that you may encounter with that crop.
For sure. Thank you, Mary. So, Mary discussed how bats are responsible for our favorite margarita ingredients, but what about some other nighttime pollinators that we might have locally? Can you talk about a couple of those real quick here?
Well, a lot of moths, and I think we kind of went over moths, but moths are great pollinators, and they usually do their pollinating in the evening, right? So many of our vegetables, as I mentioned before, they're kind of chewed on the caterpillars during the day, but maybe pollinated during the evening by the adult. And going back to the similar question with the how the plants and the pollinators are kind of tightly associated with each other, a lot of flowers, the white flowers that bloom during the late part of the evening or afternoon into the evening, those are typically moth pollinated flowers. And so one of my favorites is 4 o'clock, and I have a bunch of 4 o'clocks in my backyard, and I get the hummingbird moth, or the hawk moth is another common name that it looks like a hummingbird. When I first saw it, I was kind of blown away. So moths do pollinate a lot of our late blooming plants later in the day, white colors. I know the question also too asked about effectiveness of bats for pollinating, and Mary mentioned bats do pollinate a lot of crops in Central America, the tropics. But Holly Ober, who is our wildlife specialist at the North Florida Research and Education Center, I learned from her that our bats that we have here, the Brazilian free-tailed bat, they're actually not pollinator plants. So in North Florida, bats aren't doing any pollinating, but moths for sure are doing a good job pollinating plants all around, maybe vegetables, ornamentals. So they're important too.
Yeah, lots of nighttime pollinators out there. So Dr. Knox, this is like one of the more general questions you could get, but it's a good one. So when and how should you cut back pollinator plants?
That's a good question.
General type rule, I know it depends, but.
Right. Clearly you're going to want to cut back pollinator plants, after a freeze or frost damage like that. If they're a summer growing plant, you're going to want to cut them back in the winter time. Possible exceptions to this might be if some of these pollinator plants have hollow stems that themselves could harbor native bees. That would the stem as a native bee, in which case you might want to leave them up until they fall down naturally. But I don't think there's any general rule for cutting back pollinator plants other than at the end of the flowering period or during their dormant period would be the time to do so.
That makes sense. Try not to cut them back when they're out there doing their thing, right?
Right.
Could I add something about the tropical milkweed and cutting it back? I guess
we'll allow that.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd like to throw this in, and I probably should have mentioned it when I was talking about milkweed before, but if you have the tropical milkweed, you should be cutting it back in late fall, like in November, and cut it back, and it helps in two ways. One is it kind of gets the monarchs to go ahead and make that migration to Mexico, and it also reduces disease pressure on the monarchs.
There you go. Got some general information and some very specific information, so that's really good. Mark, we have a person interested in growing avocado trees, and this is true for a lot of fruit trees. This question gets asked: do I need a cross-pollinator type?
That's interesting. I have 2 avocados that were brought to me from South Florida sitting on my chair right here. I just got them today. So thanks, Master Garden Volunteer, for bringing those by. But if you want to grow avocados in North Florida, it's going to be a little bit tricky because they don't do well in our cold weathers. And there are some, or our cold winters, and there are some, low temperature adapted varieties. And I actually just saw one a while back in a person's, citizen's backyard, and it got burnt back during our last winter. And if you remember, our last winter was not very cold. So it doesn't give me much hope for, actually getting avocado trees up big enough to produce fruit. I've heard people trying to move them, into the garage or something during the wintertime, but it's kind of a lot of work. Now, as far as cross-pollination, I did put something in a link as far as the different strategies that plants kind of come up with to, make sure they don't kind of often sometimes mate with themselves, right? They want to get the most diversity of genes into their next generation. And a lot of our fruit trees, pollinators are really important because they need those pollinators. So, about a third of, I think, of our food requires some type of pollinator. And it has to do with the timing, like what Dr. Knox was mentioning with the beetles, right? So sometimes plants will have the male parts will be receptive or be giving out pollen before the female parts are receptive. And so those pollinators help, facilitate that reproduction. With avocados, I also shared a link that'll come up in the chat regarding, avocados in Florida. And there are two different types. So what they recommend is if you're in Central and South Florida where there's avocados, grown in residential backyards all over, you probably don't need to worry about having 2 or 3 to ensure cross-pollination because there's plenty in the area. But in North Florida, where there's not many people growing avocados, you may want to make sure that I think they have it like a strand A, strand B type of thing. It's in the link here that we're sharing. You want to make sure you get one of each to, again, make sure that the timing works out so that you get some pollination. But it's going to be tricky. So just know that, don't have the hopes maybe of starting an avocado stand in North Florida.
Fair enough.
The other problem with avocados in North Florida is we have that ambrosia beetle that's spreading
laurel wilt.
And so there has been at least one in Tallahassee that has been hit by laurel wilt. So that's another challenge to growing them here.
Yeah, it seems like most of the red bays have been taken out already. So those ambrosia beetles are looking for something to eat. So
the next one, yeah.
There you go. Heather, this is, we've touched on kind of a lot of this already, but just kind of put it in a succinct way. This person's asking, just looking for native pollinators. So what are just some tips to get out and see pollinators? What should we be looking for? Like timing, plants, places, things like that.
Yeah, so I guess from a gardening perspective, I would say always increasing the number of flowering plant species in your garden, both in abundance and diversity. Generally planting in clusters, so you have a larger floral area covering. As far as seasonality goes, aiming for 8 to 10 flowering species in your garden throughout the seasons.
Okay.
Because that will fluctuate quite a bit. But as long as there is something always flowering, that's really helpful as well. But to see different types of native pollinators, particularly native bees, planting a wide range of different plant species, I would say is the most important.
Is there a specific time of the day that pollinators tend to be more active?
Yeah, so that actually fluctuates as well.
Okay.
For my research in particular, we did most of our data collection. We did all of our data collection in the morning between 9 and 11. When it was sunny but not super hot, we conducted our research, primarily, it's hot all the time in Florida, but from May to October. So, yeah, in Florida, we kind of focused on the foraging patterns in the morning, but I would go out to collect hand traps or things at 4 or 5 p.m. and see different pollinators on some plants I had looked at, in the morning time that maybe I hadn't seen before.
That's cool. So different times of the day bring different pollinators out to play, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's limitations and variety and all sorts of studies.
Gotcha. That's awesome. So that's some things that we don't necessarily always think about. So this is a question I'm just going to kind of pose to the group, and whoever wants to take it, go for it. But this person has a garden, and we need to know how to successfully hand pollinate, or maybe they have a greenhouse, without breaking the blooms. So is there a strategy that you've used before to sort of hand pollinate, maybe in a greenhouse or a hoop house or something?
Well, I'll handle this a little bit here.
Go for it, Dr. Knox.
You know, to a certain extent, you need to know the plant that you're trying to pollinate to understand the what happens at different phases. And then in the case of magnolias, for example, we can take a magnolia that's producing pollen, and if you know the right stage that the other flower is at, that the female parts are receptive, then you simply have to transfer pollen over to the plant, and you can be messy about it. You don't have to be particular about it, and it'll work. But you know, really, you have to know a little bit something about the plant that you're trying to pollinate to do that.
That makes sense. Gotcha. All right. So it sounds like we might need a little bit more information on that question. You can get back to us on that, or just take Dr. Knox's advice, and while the plant's blooming, take pollen from one to the other. While we're with you here, Dr. Knox, this is a question that we get sometimes because of, you know, heavy metals and different things. Is it okay to put a garden for pollinators in septic drain fields?
You know, I don't see a problem with that at all, other than making sure that the plant that you're putting there matches the site conditions. You know, I don't think, you know, extra nutrients or extra moisture from the septic drain field will affect anything detrimentally that I'm aware.
Not that we're aware of. So we're not poisoning our pollinators by doing that. Okay, very good. Awesome. Mary, this has kind of been touched on in other places, but let's say we're going to plant an above ground pollinator garden, like in a raised bed. Is there a specific soil that we're looking for that?
Everybody has their own favorite soil mix. And there's a lot of different ways that you can go. You know, we're always advising people, especially with vegetable gardens, if you want to do a vegetable garden here in Florida, to construct a raised bed and put in clean soil.
Yeah.
One of the most popular mixes is like 50% topsoil. You have to make sure it's clean though, because if they're just going and scraping it off someplace, it can be full of weeds and torpedo grass and all kinds of things like that. So maybe bagged clean topsoil and then 50% compost. There's a lot of other mixes, like about 50% topsoil and then, you know, compost and potting mix. There's commercial mixes that
Sure.
you can get from nurseries that come bulk or bagged. One way too, if you have access to bulk mushroom compost, you can use that just plain 100%
Gotcha.
mushroom compost. That makes a really good bed.
Okay, there you go. Lots of options for soil. Dr. Knox, this is an interesting question. I've never gotten this one before, but from a Zoom listener, do cut flowers have any nectar to use in a pinch?
Yeah, a qualified yes. Of course, the flower that you're talking about here, you can't do a cut hybrid tea rose, for example, and expect that to provide pollen. But certainly some of the flowers that we know provide nectar to pollinators can do that for a limited period of time.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure it would effectively feed very many pollinators from a vase of daisies or whatever, something like that. But in theory, yes, I know in research projects, they actually do use cut flowers when they have caged butterflies, for example, to feed them. So.
Gotcha. So if you wanted to stick a vase of flowers outside, you may attract a pollinator here and there for a short time.
Right. Right.
Good enough. Mark, this is an interesting question, kind of going along to, can we have our cake and eat it too? Zoom listener, don't birds eat pollinators? If so, is it a bad idea to have bird baths and bird feeders near pollinator plants? It's a dog eat dog.
So it's the circle of life, Daniel. So, you know, you can enjoy watching the butterflies flutter around and the caterpillars eat the plants. But you might also enjoy watching the birds come to the garden, and it could be really entertaining to watch the birds pick off the caterpillars from the plants. So it depends on, you know, we actually had one here. You know, we have a pollinator garden, and we had a bird bath and a feeder. And you know, after a lot of comments about it, we did move it. But and I did find a document that kind of went into this a little bit from the University of Vermont. And they do recommend, if you have a pollinator garden, to maybe put your bird bath, your bird feeder at some type of a distance away. But we do got to remember that birds fly great distances, right? And so even if your bird bath and your feeder is separated by 100 feet, 200 feet, you're creating a buffet for birds, right? And, you know, that's part of it. Not all of those caterpillars, and that's their life history, right? They know that all those caterpillars are not going to become adults. They're planning on some loss there. And we're doing a good thing by planting, bringing in pollinators, and then feeding the organisms above them. So, you know, I get a lot of questions too on like the snakes going up the bird feeder, and, you know, oh gosh, how do I stop it? Well, you know, the snakes got to eat too. You know, birds got to eat, caterpillars got to eat. So we're planting and helping wildlife in various ways. So you can try to separate them, but, you know, I don't know how successful that'll be, because again, you're making a big buffet for them.
Yeah, birds got to eat. That's the takeaway, I think.
Birds got to eat. Everyone's got to eat, Beth.
There you go. So, Mary, someone gave us a Zoom listener. Someone gave me a passion flower dug up from a native type area, a natural area. Is this native to our area? It was covered in bees.
Well, there's different varieties or species of passion flower. We do have a native passion vine. It is a great host plant and nectar plant. There are 4 different butterfly species that use it as a host plant. Most commonly the Gulf fritillary and our state butterfly, the zebra longwing. Also the Julia and the variegated fritillary will use that as a host plant. Wonderful plant, very vigorous, beautiful blooms. But just keep in mind that it can get aggressive in your yard, and it can spread. You know, with vines coming up all over after it gets well established.
So the answer here is yes, probably native.
Probably.
But be careful, it can take over. So, yeah.
Good summary, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. That's really good. So, Mary, we're going to switch over to Heather for this question. Heather, I don't know that you've seen this one before, but we're gonna pose it to you. So, in this warm winter that we had last year, we've documented some some second flowerings of plants that typically only flower once, like amaryllis, gardenia, and Indian hawthorn. Does this second flowering have implications for pollinators?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not super familiar with that specific plant species and the impact that it has on those pollinators, but I think climate change in general and the way that it affects bloom periods, it also affects emergence patterns, like we talked about with different insect species. Yeah, you know, I think it kind of ties into what's being provided for insects and how that's influencing their lifestyles over time. You know, I know Mary touched on the migration patterns of monarchs earlier too, and cutting back tropical milkweed. So it is an issue for sure. I think we don't fully understand all the implications, obviously, and how it affects pollinator health. But for me, I think, you know, the floral phenology, how those bloom periods are affected based on when insects are starting to emerge. And also, you know, different diseases and pests that become more prevalent in warmer temperatures too, I think is also a concern. But Dr. Knox, do you know anything about the particular flower that Daniel mentioned?
Well, generally, I would say that I would expect, you know, more flowers the better for a generalist pollinator.
Okay.
But then when you have things flowering out of sync, it would affect the specialist pollinator that might be associated with that particular plant, in that there might not be any benefit to the specialist pollinator. So it probably is on a case-by-case basis.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. Well, I appreciate that. That's something we don't often think about. Excellent discussion there from Heather and Gary. So we're right here at 1 o'clock. But I have to say, we've only got 3 questions left. So we're like at a record pace for me, you know, always behind here. But if you want to stick around with us, we've got a couple more questions. But if you need to get out of here, we appreciate it. Please remember to take our survey. We'll post the link to the survey in the chat. Please take that. It helps us kind of learn how we did and what we won't need to do better in the future, and gives us some good programming ideas, things that you'd like to see us do. So take that that survey, and with that, we're going to press on. So kind of continuing that line of questioning, sort of related to possible climate change there in the North Florida, like we've been seeing. This is a Zoom question. Dr. Knox, we'll stay with you and Heather. Do you have any information on how pollinators might be affected by a warming climate in Florida?
I think Heather actually touched on that a little bit earlier. You know, the fact that many flowering times are affected by the warm temperatures that you get. And so in mild winters, you might end up with things flowering earlier and earlier. And if there are a specialist pollinator, and if they get out of sync with when the pollinator emerges and when the flower is flowering, then it could detrimentally affect things. Heather, you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, so just any organism that kind of depends on those temperature cues. And when those are kind of thrown out of whack, various things can happen.
That makes sense. All right, that's good. I'm going to go for Mary on this one right here. Mary, see if you can help me on this one. This is a late comer to the question field, a Zoom question. We're seeing fewer butterflies and dragonflies this year in our landscape. Is this a population decline, or just maybe because it's so hot right now in August? What do you think on that one?
You know, I'll have inquiries from people who say that, and then across the county, I'll have people who say, I have so many butterflies right now. Where are they all coming from? And I don't have enough food for them all. So I think they're spotty. They're not always, you know, evenly distributed. I have tons of dragonflies around my house. You know, of course, I live closer to the water, and it's low and kind of swampy, and tons of them, and lots of butterflies as well. So I think it just varies. I don't know of any widespread decline. Do you, Heather?
I mean, I think the first one that comes to mind is you know, monarchs, but I can't think of any butterflies in particular as a direct result of increased temperatures. And you know, similar to you, I have dragonflies all over my backyard as well.
So maybe this needs to add some pollinator plants into their yard.
And look about pesticide use.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. There you go. So check your yard. You know, if you don't have a lot of diversity of pollinator plants, maybe add some, and maybe check your pesticide use. If not in your landscape, around the neighborhood.
Daniel, there was earlier
Yes.
a question in the Zoom chat that I was going to address. It had to do with compost.
Yeah, go for it.
I think, you know, the question was, you know, how does a compost pile affect pollinators? Should I have it kind of far away from the pollinator garden?
Yeah.
And I think it probably might be helpful, especially if you're putting fresh materials into that compost pile. You know, you've probably noticed various butterflies, bees, whatnot, going after raw fruit, right? Like fresh fruit that's been, dropped, or you're at a picnic and they want to come all over your fruit. So, it might be actually beneficial to have them around. So
yeah, some of Heather's fly larvae is probably eating around in there too.
there you go. Some of those baby flies, the maggots are, waiting to go pollinate one of Heather's favorite flowers.
There you go. That's awesome. So yeah, compost pile is probably beneficial to pollinators. So add one for many reasons. So this is a final question. This is more of an kind of an IPM question that Mary touched on earlier with eating caterpillars, but we know wasps predate caterpillars, but do they predate scale insects also? Dr. Knox, do you know on this one?
There are some wasps that do predate scales. That's a general statement. I can't give you any specific examples, but I know in some of the research we've done that yes, there are some wasps that do that.
Okay, that's good. And our final question, this comes from a Facebook listener. So our folks on Facebook, feel free to ask questions. We'll try to get to them if we can. Are gingers good pollinator attractors? And just whoever wants to hit that one. Have you noticed a ginger attracting pollinators?
Gingers can attract pollinators. I wouldn't put them at the top of my list.
Okay.
But I'll also add that a lot of gingers are shade plants. So there's an opportunity that gingers might be able to attract pollinators in a shade situation.
So what specific pollinators do you think, are the butterflies, or what might come to a ginger?
I think
I have some information on those.
Gingers, because I think they produce nectar quite a bit.
I think I've read about flies as well.
Of course.
Back to flies, of course.
Yeah, I'm actually just the fly girl today, so.
All right. So the short answer to our gingers good pollinators, yes, of some kind, and you can grow them in shade. So very good. Well, hey, I want to thank everybody for tuning in today for this Gardening with Pollinators webinar. I want to thank Dr. Knox and Heather especially for joining us. We appreciate you guys being able to be with us today. We hope you enjoyed it. We certainly enjoyed having you with us. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, as always, thank you to Mark and Mary, Julie, Beth, and all the rest of our Northwest horticulture team. We try to do a good job for you guys, and I appreciate Mark and Mary, Julie and Beth for being on with us today.
And thanks for being a good MC, Daniel.
Oh yeah, well, we're doing our best here. We work with our limited resources that we have. It's a 1:07, so we're like 20 minutes ahead of schedule, but we're gonna go ahead for the day. Thank you everybody for being on, and we'll see you here back in 2 weeks for our next topic. Be on the lookout for that. Thanks everybody, and y'all have a great afternoon.
Bye everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for coming.
Bye.